Let me know when we're ready. The Apostle Paul is writing to Titus around the year 62, maybe 62, 63 AD, somewhere in that range. Just a reminder, we've been away from Titus for a couple of weeks. Titus is being written after the book of Acts ends, and Paul is moving around from place to place, and he's left Titus on the island of Crete. I'm not going to pull up a map and show you Crete. You could go back and kind of look at some of the old, one of the last two messages to see that. But he's left Titus there on the island of Crete as the pastor of a church. And Titus has been around for a while. Titus and Paul have been working together for quite some time, probably 15 or more years. And so he's kind of like a seasoned, if you can say 15 years is a seasoned veteran, that seems like, at least in biblical times, that would have been kind of a seasoned veteran in ministry. But Titus has a difficult challenge here in this place in Crete, to pastor the Cretans, right? I take my son down to a batting cage in Bangor, and man, those kids are Cretans. Some of those kids have some foul, dirty mouths, and there was a girl down there, and she said something just raw, just bad. And I said, there was a group of kids, and I said, teenage girls, and I said, excuse me, my son is 12 years old. He doesn't need to be hearing that. I'm not going to say what she said, but it was bad. It was like one of the worst things like you could refer to like publicly. And, they all laughed and giggled, and I just, turned around, and I picked up a couple of baseballs to throw, and I wasn't done yet. They were just kind of, the Cretans were laughing. And I just said, ladies, you shouldn't be laughing. You should feel shame right now. You should be ashamed of the way you're talking. It's shameful, or something like that, right, Josh? And the laughing stopped, and the Cretans left. So, it was maybe I could have been better off trying to minister the gospel to some of these Cretans, but man, if you heard what I heard, and your little 12-year-old kid is there, things he doesn't know about yet, you know what I mean? And hopefully doesn't know about for a while, but of course, hang around with the world and they find these things out pretty quickly. So that's why I always say, better learning from the church than from the world. And that's why I talk to my kids about things that maybe people think you talk to your kids too early about some of these things. I don't think so. Our kids have the internet machine, and that will tell you, and their friends will tell you, in the world will tell you more than they should know. Crete is a rough place to minister. It's full of Cretans. It's full of liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons. I didn't say it. God did, right? And it's full of meaningless talk and deception, and so it's a challenge to minister to the Cretans. But as I've said in the last couple of times we've met on Sunday nights, Titus is just the man for the job. He is the exact guy to minister to this congregation. And that's why Paul left him on Crete. Now, a year ago, we went through 1 Timothy 3. And we went through it in depth. Like, probably spent, 6 to 10 weeks, I think. Probably did about 4, 5, 6 weeks in 1 Timothy 3. And then probably spent another few weeks kind of dealing with some wisdom issues with regard to biblically qualified pastors. The temptation was to do that again, but I thought, look, if you guys really want an in-depth look at biblically qualified pastors and stuff like that, we have something from a year ago. I really wanted to get everything into just 1 week, and that just wasn't possible. So we talked about the home, the marriage a little bit last time we met. And this time, kind of a summary look at just the rest of the qualifications. So we're not going to go super deep into each one of the issues. I might go a little deeper into some than others. I might kind of skim through some qualities, but we're going to kind of move through all 4 of these verses tonight, or at least 3.5 of these verses tonight. First, Titus 1, verses 6 through 9. Titus needs to appoint biblically qualified men to pastor the churches. And what we saw last time we met was he needs to appoint men whose marriages are in order. In seminary, they tell you your spouse, your wife, will make or break your ministry. So I tell you. I know a pastor who essentially implied to me that his wife made ministry difficult. And so it's important, Paul writes here, it's important that Titus appoint pastors whose marriages are in order. And he needs to appoint pastors whose children are in order. And that's where we start today. Titus 1, we'll read verses 5 and 6 here. For this reason, I left you in Crete that you would set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you. And what I spoke to you about several weeks ago was that setting in order what remains is accomplished by appointing biblically qualified pastors. Namely, if any man is above reproach, the husband of one wife, that's where we stopped last time, having children who believe, not accused of dissipation or rebellion. So he needs to have children who believe. Now, when we look at these pastoral qualifications, one thing you have to kind of remember is, and we looked at this just last time we met, is that it's not talking about status. Remember when we were talking about marriage, it wasn't status, it was character. So it wasn't just like the guy who's officially married to somebody. I mean, his marriage is falling apart, but he's married to one woman, and he's only going to be married to one woman. Meanwhile, he's looking at pornography and he's, whatever else. It's not a status issue. It is a character issue. And so his parenting is a character issue. His household is a character issue. This is slightly different than what Paul wrote to Timothy. Paul wrote to Timothy that the pastor needs to keep his children under control with all dignity. And so it's the same general idea. The idea is that the pastor needs to manage his household well. And that includes keeping his children in submission. Why? Because submission is a mechanism that's important in any structure. Submission is the mechanism that God uses in order to maintain unity in a local church. Submission is a mechanism that God uses when it comes to not having anarchy in response to the government. Submission is a mechanism God uses in the home between a husband and a wife so that there's unity between the husband and wife. And so submission is something that's important when it comes to the pastor and his children, not just the pastor, any Christian and his children. One thing I find is that a lot of Christians, they give their children a pass on submission when they get to their teenage years. And they assume that teenage rebellion is just, that's normal. And so it'll pass. It's a phase, it'll pass. But biblically speaking, that is not how you handle that. Biblically speaking, you do not allow rebellion in your home. And if the pastor is allowing rebellion in his home, that's a problem. If the pastor can't keep his children in submission, then how in the world is he going to endorse and encourage submission within the local church? That is, if the kids won't submit to the guy, then how in the world are the church isn't going to submit to him either? Submission is important because it is the mechanism that brings about unity in the local church and in the home. And the pastor needs to be able to teach his children submission. And I would argue that any Christian needs to be able to teach their children submission. And that's something that's lacking today. The pastor, or any Christian for that matter, needs to be able to command respect from his children. Because if the kids don't respect him, other people won't respect him either. Pastor needs to lead in such a way that the children follow. Now, it doesn't mean that the pastor is perfect. It doesn't mean the pastor doesn't make mistakes. He is imperfect, and he'll make a lot of mistakes. And it doesn't mean that the children are perfect. And it doesn't mean that they won't make mistakes. And it doesn't mean that they have moments where they mess up or they rebel or something like that on an issue or something like that. Like, that's going to happen. Kids are sinners just like anyone else. They're going to have issues. It doesn't mean that the kids are perfect, but in general, they are submissive in character. Here, Titus he says that the man needs to have children who believe. And again, we're not talking about status. It's not saying, okay, so the pastor's 5-year-old kid isn't saved. He can't be a pastor. You understand? We're not dealing with status here. We're dealing with character. Paul's talking about the way the man manages those in his house. Think of it like this. While my children are in my house, and I say this to my kids, while you're in my house, this will never happen. Just, there's certain things like, you will, I don't want to use certain illustrations, but one of my young kids says that when they grow up, they're going to dye their hair blue. And I said, you will never do it in my house. It will not happen in my house. No, this is a very young kid, so we'll see, there's some things there's other things, but as long as you're in this house, you will not dress immodestly. As long as you're in this house, you will not date a lost person. There are certain things that just, that's not happening. As long as you're under my roof, we will worship the Lord. Now, I can't make you worship the Lord. I can't make you get saved. I can't change your heart. I can't do. Does anyone here have the ability to change anyone else's heart? If you do, I can use you. There's a whole bunch of people I know. You know what I mean? And we can maybe be like, you could put your hands on them and you could la 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 la, whatever, and blow on them and someone catch them and hopefully catch them because whatever. Obviously, I'm joking about that. You can't change someone's heart. You can't. So my kids can be inwardly rebellious and outwardly submissive, right? And I can't control what's going on in their heart. This is not so much like, oh, listen, so this status, if your kid doesn't get saved by such and such an age, now you can no longer be the pastor of a church. It's more about the pastor's character and how he manages his house. When my children are in my house, we'll serve the Lord. When they leave, I can't control that. I hope that during the time that they're under my roof, I hope that they see enough of my walk that it's legitimate, that my wife's walk, that it's legitimate, and that we've been able to instill in them a desire to serve the Lord as best as we can, but we can't make them get saved and we can't make them be godly. We can't. They need to get saved by grace through faith. God doesn't have grandchildren. Just because I'm saved doesn't mean I can make them get saved. But when they're living in my roof, under my roof and under my authority, we're going to serve the Lord. And we're going to do it as a family. And this is going to be something that we're part of. We're going to do discipleship as a family. And that's not because my job is the pastor. It's because I'm a Christian. I believe that regardless of whether or not my job is a pastor, we would do family discipleship, period. And that's just a principle that we're going to practice in our house. And the hope is that the children see that and they come to embrace the gospel the way I embrace the gospel. His children are not accused of dissipation or rebellion. The word dissipation is talking about, according to the leading lexicon out there today, it's talking about wastefulness, reckless abandon, debauchery, or wild living. It's the same word that's used in Ephesians 5:18, be not drunk with wine. And so they can't be rebellious kids who live wildly. Again, they're 25 years old and they walk away from the faith and they're not in my house. I mean, I can't control whether they get saved. Would I be heartbroken about it? Absolutely. If all 4 of my kids walk away from the Lord, well, now there's something to look at, right? What's going on there? Usually when there's smoke, there's fire. But dissipation here and rebellion go hand in hand. Again, the pastor's children are children, and children will be children, and children will be foolish, right? Were you foolish when you were a child? I like listening to John MacArthur talk about attention deficit disorder. But there's this supposed thing, a supposed attention deficit disorder, and they're treating kids with Ritalin for it and all this type of garbage, right? And John MacArthur says, every kid's got that. I had it. I used to go to school and I'd get in trouble. Little Johnny wasn't paying attention, and when I got home and my parents found out that little Johnny got in trouble, I got spanked. You know what I mean? and he'd talk about how he was disciplined, and he essentially basically learned discipline. Kids are going to be undisciplined at times, and they're going to need to learn discipline. Kids are going to be foolish. Listen, when I was a kid, I was as foolish as they come. You might think I'm as foolish as they come now. I don't know. But you were pretty foolish too. There aren't too many kids I know that are the beaming poster boys for spirituality. Most of them are immature, most kids, right? Immature and foolish for the most part. But they cannot be known for rebellion and riotous living, and especially rebellion that goes unchecked in the home. Again, this is about how the pastor is managing his house. If he's not managing his house, if he's letting rebellion go unchecked, he's not qualified to be a pastor of a church. He needs to take care of his home first. Paul's writing about those children who are rebellious, such that they oppose the gospel and live in a manner that's opposed to it, and it goes unchecked. A man who doesn't have control of his house. That's really what we're seeing here. And so, again, we're dealing with character, not status. Just like the husband of one wife is a character issue, not a status issue. Titus needs to appoint biblically qualified men to pastor the churches in Crete, men whose houses, whose marriages are in order, whose children are in order, men of character in verse 7. For the overseer must be above reproach as God's steward. Again, we see that term above reproach in here, right? Paul's writing about this overseer, the pastor, elder, bishop that Peter writes about in 1 Peter 5, that we see in Acts chapter 20 when Paul's dealing with the elders of Ephesus, when he stops and sees them on his way back from the third missionary journey, the pastor, elder, bishops of the church. And we've already seen this blamelessness, this above reproach. We talked about that in verse 6 and spent a lot of time talking about that last year. So I'm not going to really deal with it in great detail here. But he must be above reproach as God's steward. And that word means, it's the same word. You ever hear, most of the people in this room have heard the term dispensationalism, right? The adults, you've heard the word dispensationalism. And we actually have a study on that. If you're confused about that, or you want some info on that, we have, Chad, we probably have probably 15, I think we have 15 or 20, at least probably 15 or 20, maybe longer than that, in a Sunday school series. Is that one of the series we have archived, saved? You'd have to check. I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that. But the word that stands behind, the Greek word that stands behind our English word dispensationalism is oikonomos. And it's a manager of household affairs. And here, so that's why one of the reasons why when we went through that study, it was several years ago, I would talk about God managing the affairs of men. I didn't use the word dispensationalism a whole lot. I said we're dealing with how God manages the affairs of men, because it was kind of like it's easier to understand. If I keep saying dispensationalism, you're like, wait, what are you talking about? But if I keep saying this is how God manages the affairs of men, you're like, oh, that makes sense. Right? So I try to make it like easier to understand. Well, that's this word, right? So the overseer must be above reproach as God's steward, as a manager of God's household affairs. as an under shepherd, really, to the chief shepherd, to the great shepherd. So we're talking about management here, managing household affairs. He's an estate manager. He's accountable to God for how he manages what is God's. The church is not the pastor's. The church is not his. The church belongs to God, and the pastor is to manage what is God's property. The pastor is an above-reproach manager of God's household affairs, and there are some things here in verse 7 that would disqualify him. That is, there are negative character traits. The overseer must be above reproach as God's steward. Not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not addicted to wine, not pugnacious, not fond of sordid gain. And just real quick to go over in summary, not self-willed, that is, he's not stubborn or arrogant. Word only shows up here and one other place in Scripture, in 2 Peter 2:10, where it talks about unrighteous rebels. He's not a self-centered person or a proud narcissist. He's not quick-tempered. That is, this kind of goes hand in hand with a self-willed person, a hothead. Can't control himself, right, which is inconsistent with ministry. Pastor needs to be able to keep his cool. Believe me, you're going to run into a lot of immature people who can't keep their cool. And as a pastor, you need to be able to keep your cool for sure. He is not addicted to wine. Word sometimes translated here is not a drunkard. Right? Scriptures clearly speak about this in other places. Just a few verses. Wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging, and whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. It is not for kings, O Lemuel. It is not for kings to drink wine, nor princes strong drink. Why? Lest they drink and forget the law and pervert the judgment of any of the afflicted. It would affect their leadership. It would affect their judgment. It would affect their spirituality. And if it wasn't for kings, it's certainly not for men of God. That's for sure. Of course, we know that alcohol can have very strong temptation. When I first got saved, I would think I'd see like the I've talked about this. I'd see the commercials of like the Coors Light in a bottle with the beating bottle. Even now, I like a soda in a bottle, like a frothy, like a, what do you call that? Like a frozen, not a frozen, like a cold, chilled bottle. Like I like soda in a cold bottle, but I was just getting saved, and I'd see these beer commercials, and I'm like, oh yeah, man, look at that. That looks so good. It was so tempting. Look not thou upon the wine when it is red, when it giveth his color in the cup, when it moveth itself aright. At last it biteth like a serpent and stingeth like an adder. Told to resist such temptation because it is damaging. It has a sting. The overseer must not be self-willed or quick-tempered or addicted to wine, or the word here, pugnacious. If we have another one of these pens, I would appreciate if maybe somebody could grab one of these pens. This is getting damaged, and it's going to damage my screen. Oh, wow. That was quick. Throw this one out. No coronavirus on this one? Doesn't really matter, I've already had it. So, not pugnacious, that is not violent is the word here, but that's in 1 Timothy 3, not violent but gentle, Paul writes. An overseer is not led by his uncontrolled temper, but by the Spirit of God. He can't be a belligerent person or a violent person. He's not fond of sordid gain. That would disqualify half the guys on TV. If you only knew what some of these guys made, like if you only knew what some of the people that even like the better teachers, like the guys that we think he's not so bad, if you knew what Charles Stanley made, you'd be like, oh, I don't know about that one. That doesn't quite sound right. That doesn't sound like the right pastoral salary to me. You know what I mean? The Reverend T.D. Jakes, it doesn't sound like he's making the right amount of money for, a man of God. Some of these guys, man, it doesn't spell out a nice picture, let's put it that way. The Pat Robertsons of the world and the TV evangelists, they make some type of money. 1 Timothy 3:3 says that the pastor is free from the love of money. People in positions of authority need to be trustworthy with money, and spiritual leaders can take advantage of people spiritually and financially. That's for sure. Some of these guys, send in so much money, send in your prayer requests with a gift, and we'll pray. And it's like, oh yeah, send the gift in. He'll pray when you send the gift in. The bigger the gift. How do people not see through this stuff? How can people be so foolish to see a guy who is fond of sordid gain, like some of these TV preachers? Like Benny Hinn said, God has called us to San Diego, but if we don't sell out, then God hasn't called us there. If we don't sell out the stadium. It's like, really? You really believe this guy? You really think this guy's qualified? Some pastors are in ministry for what they can gain. Some pastors handle all the money. I've heard of even some local pastors. One guy said to me, and I haven't been able to verify this, but one guy said to me that he went to one of his former pastors, and said that he wanted to talk about getting an account of the finances. And we'll do an account of the finances tonight. And anyone who wants an account of our finances, you just send an email to, I guess I won't say it out loud on the internet machine, but send it to, you see me, I'll give you the email address, talk to our treasurer, and we'll get you the financial reports. But anyway, he wanted an account of the money, and the pastor said, don't you worry about the money, I'll take care of the money. I handle the money. That's what he reportedly said. And this stuff's out there. That is not the pastor's job to handle the money, okay? There are stewards in the church, biblically speaking, deacons who are responsible for such matters, and the church is responsible. Now, that doesn't mean the pastor's not involved. Like, the pastor is the overseer of the church, okay? So he does oversee the ministry and really all aspects of the ministry. That doesn't mean he completely ignores the financial aspect. I'm involved. We have a committee of people, and we feel that's the best way to do it. The deacons and I, and we appoint a couple other guys. We get together and we look at the finances, and we work up a budget. It's usually a pretty easy task. It's not a hard budget to work up. But if there's a guy who controls all that, if the pastor controls all that, that's not right. That's not right. Now, I do want to correct one false understanding that's out there, because some people think that the pastor needs to live in poverty, okay? And that's also not what the Apostle Paul teaches, because he says that the labor is worthy of his hire. And he actually and explains that in very clear terms, that the pastor should be supported by, the preacher of the gospel should be supported by and through the gospel. That's different than doing it for the money. So, like for me, to be perfectly honest with you, I minister here. At the same time, I realize I need to be able to be supported, right? I need to be able to support my family. If I can't support my family, I'm worse than an infidel. That's different than saying, there was a situation that I was connected to where the pastor was so angry with the finance people because he wanted a raise. I would say two things about that. One, something ain't right if the pastor's asking for a raise. All right, on two accounts. One, maybe the church isn't doing their job, and maybe the pastor's heart isn't right. All right. I think the only thing I've ever done at this church is ask for not a raise. Right? Is that pretty fair? I've only asked not to receive a raise in this church, and I've done that several times. And one time I strongly encouraged not to get a raise, and they wanted to give a cost of living adjustment, and they schemed about somehow to get me a cost of living adjustment for that year instead of the next. You guys remember that? I remember being impressed with how you were able to somehow submit to my request not to get a raise and still get me a raise. I couldn't even believe how you guys pulled that off. But if the pastor's running around saying, I need more money, something's not right. Now, it could be fair for a pastor to say, look, I'm having a hard time supporting my family on this income. I'm going to have to take another job on the side as well. Pastors will do that, and that's okay. But for a pastor to say, you guys are greedy, I can't even believe what you pay me, and stuff like that, like it's, wow, something's not right there. You know, the pastor is not supposed to be fond of sordid gain. On a side note, I'm very pleased with... Some people here think that my salary package isn't sufficient. I'm very pleased with what you guys, how this church supports me. I'm very pleased with it. So I'm not looking for any raise. In fact, I'm very satisfied with. I'm able to live on what I receive, and I'm able to manage that very comfortably. So. I don't know who the finance committee is this year, but that's probably a conversation we'll be having at some point. Anyway, let's move on to the next thing here. And we see these 5 disqualifiers: not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not addicted to wine, not pugnacious, not fond of sordid gain, but hospitable. How satisfied I am, real quick, with what I end up making is my wife's like, hey, listen, I should go over there and work as the cleaner. Right? We could get some more money. And I'm like, no, we're good. We're fine. I don't want to make more money right now. There's some reasons behind that, but we're good to go. The church has done very nicely in supporting our family, and we are very thankful for how this church has supported us over the years. Anyway, there's some positive qualities, which are a lot of times like kind of the opposite of some of the negatives here. So they're not these things, but hospitable. Right? And, we spent some time talking about that a year ago. Maybe it was a little longer. It was a year ago. Now, the last year and a half has been a little hard to do hospitality in the traditional sense of the word, but I think we're gonna be opening up our home again here pretty soon, and we'll see how that goes. Hospitable, loving what is good, sensible, just, devout, self-controlled. Again, the opposite of some of these negative qualities. Really kind of an explanation of a godly, mature, steady, dependable person, and the type of person that could manage a church in Crete. Titus needs to appoint biblically qualified men to pastor the churches. He needs to appoint men whose houses are in order, men of character, who are devoted to sound doctrine. Look at the end of verse 9. Holding fast the faithful word, which is in accordance with the teaching, so that he will be able both to exhort in sound doctrine and to refute those who contradict. And so he needs to hold fast the faithful word. He needs to be fierce, as one guy writes, fiercely attached to the truth of God's word, committed to it. Yarbrough says that he may even, quote, he may even look fanatical to those not convinced of the truth. I believe that I've experienced that to a certain extent, where some have looked at me and thought I was fanatical about things, and you got to understand, when you're being held to account for, leading something like God's church, there are your opinions and my opinions, and then there's what God says. And sometimes it's like, well, I think this way or feel this way or whatever, but God says this. And when God says this, you don't have a choice. And that can look fanatical. You can look like a fanatic. And people are like, oh, come on, really? I mean, is this really that big of a deal? And you say, did God say that? I mean, if God said it, and I'm an under shepherd, and I'm accountable to do what God says, I don't have a choice. I have a choice. That's sometimes what it means to hold fast the faithful word. Timothy, in 2 Timothy 1:13, Timothy was to retain the standard of sound words, which is why training is so important. A pastor needs to be able to identify sound doctrine. He needs to understand the Word of God enough to know, even in those difficult situations, what we must follow, what God actually says. He needs to be able to point out truth. He needs to be able to point out error. He needs to be trained in how to properly handle the text of Scripture, and that happens. And that's why I'm so convinced, I'm convinced in the necessity of seminary. With rare exception, perhaps. I'm convinced of the necessity of seminary. Having been through Bible college, having been through a couple programs in seminary, I could see the value of it. It's just so important, and not just from a formal training standpoint, but just from the relationships of the people in seminary who get to know you and watch your life, and they help you bridge the gap between 2,000 years from now, and they help kind of you see some of the things that you need to kind of deal with even in your character and your life. There have been people back when the seminary in Lansdale was open. There were people that they said, "Hey, listen, we don't believe you're qualified to be a pastor." That would be tough. That'd be tough to hear, and that's tough to say when you're. Schools of educational institutions are often places of business, right? The more students, the better. And here the school is saying, you can keep coming and you can keep attending here, but we don't believe you're qualified to be a pastor. And so, if you're the student, you're probably going to stop giving them money, right? But there's godly men. Some of the most godly men I know. That's why the first people I asked to come in here and preach, apart from Joe. Joe is as the Nivelt boys call him, the vice pastor, right? So apart from the vice pastor here, most of the guys I call in here to preach are seminary professors. Did you know about that? You didn't know that? Yeah. The cat's out of the bag. They think you're the vice pastor. So, but you kind of are, actually. Kind of. So, the first guys I call are seminary professors. Guys like Dr. Tuttle, right? Guys like Dr. Harbin. Some of those godly people I know. Seminary is important, right? Seminary help you understand true and false doctrine. Anyway, notice why it's so important that he hold fast the faithful word. First, he needs, you see this purpose, holding fast the faithful word, which is in accordance with the teaching, so that, which is kind of like a purpose/result statement, so that he will be able both to, so there's two things that he's going to be able to do. One is to exhort in sound doctrine. He understands what sound doctrine is, and again, his training helps him understand that. One of the main duties of a pastor is to hold fast to sound doctrine, to speak those things which are fitting for sound doctrine. Titus 2:1 will say. He needs to exhort people in the truth. That is, encourage people in the truth. And he needs to refute those who contradict. He needs to help a person see when they're in theological error. And I'm going to argue that many of the people who parade around as pastors today, they don't really understand a lot about truth and error. Some of the things that some of these people have shared online is like, you really don't understand truth and error if you're going to share that. You really don't understand who is a good teacher and who isn't if you're going to share articles written by N.T. Wright, who John MacArthur calls New Testament wrong. But he needs to be able to protect the church against wolves. Yarbrough says, quote, "Ministers had better know their stuff." It's so profound, right? Ministers better know their stuff, right? They need to be able to help a person see what is true and false doctrine. They need to be able to help a person see when they've erred. And that's not easy to do, because nobody wants to hear that. I don't want to hear it. Titus is on Crete, trying to set in order things, and he can't do it alone. Crete is a large island, and so he needs to appoint biblically qualified pastors. men of character whose houses are in order, men who are devoted to sound doctrine. And this is a message that I need to hear today. I need to constantly check myself. Am I a person of godly character? Is my house in order? Am I holding fast to the faithful word? I need to ask myself those questions. And again, my life's not perfect. There are times where I feel convicted about certain things that I need to look at, right? And I need to manage better. But the church needs to listen to this charge as well. There are so many unqualified pastors out there, so many untrained hipsters out there, right? I like to say parading around as legitimate pastors. They know how to draw a crowd, but they don't know how to handle the text of Scripture. Know how to appeal to the masses, but they don't know sound doctrine. And so the church needs to take up the charge to not only appoint biblically qualified men, but to hold their pastors accountable, to be biblically qualified. And one day, when I leave this place, and I eventually will, I don't know when, but I eventually will, either by death or by, not by coronavirus apparently, so that's good, but by, who knows, by some other means. When I leave this place, this church will need to look for a biblically qualified pastor. And it will need to appoint a man of godly character whose house is in order and who is devoted to and trained in God's truth. I told you I'd be quick today. I told you we'd get out a little early so we could have our meeting. Let's take our hymnals and turn to 639, right? 639. We'll sing 2 verses of that. Then we will jump right into